Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Huge controversy in the wake of the Qatar Grand Prix, with pretty much every single driver saying that they were very nearly, or indeed they were at times, passing out and losing consciousness during parts of the end of the Grand Prix, given the incredibly taxing physical conditions the drivers had to deal with. Frankly, it's a miracle there were no serious accidents here, where drivers could literally have lost consciousness, gone off the track, caused a massive accident. That didn't occur luckily, but many of the drivers are saying this was either on or very much over the line in terms of what should be allowed. Is this something we're going to have to deal with in Qatar? What were the key reasons for it? What should they change going forwards? Very much interested to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. So during the race, it was clear that Logan Sargeant was massively struggling with the physical conditions, and even we heard Fernando Alonso right on the radio talking about how his seat was really hot. The cars are incredibly hot in those conditions. Hugely high air temperature there in Qatar. I think it started the Grand Prix as like 32-degree air temperature. Reminded many of even Bahrain 2005. That race was run in the daytime in Bahrain, and it was exceedingly hot. The cars were blowing up all over the place. The drivers had an awful time of it. And frankly, this is not a new thing to motorsport, but it's not seen particularly often in Formula One. And this is why there's been lots of talk about it. We saw Stroll, we saw Albon, many other drivers, having got out of their cars, could barely get out of their cars, right? They're really struggling physically. And actually, afterwards, we got to see some astonishing footage, really. Like, let's just have a look at this Lance Stroll as he comes down the main straight here. His head is bouncing all over the place. And there's a question as to whether he's actually on the verge of losing consciousness here. Now, on the straight, you'd think it would be okay, but it's in the high G-force corners. The lack of blood pressure the drivers have, given the circumstances, the extreme heat, and the extreme physicality of this circuit anyway, plus the mandated stops, the implications that had, and we'll discuss that in a second, caused many of the drivers to be on the verge of losing consciousness. And it's during the high G corners, really, where this was mostly seen. You can actually see on Charles Leclerc's onboard, I'll just play it through quickly. Look how much his head is bouncing around from left to right here. This is not what you normally see from a Formula One driver. Their neck muscles are very strong. This is indicative of someone who is really going through it and is at the end of their tether physically. This is what Logan Sargeant realised. And at the time, I was like, well, maybe Sargeant maybe he wasn't coming into the weekend quite race fit enough. And actually, he was unwell. He'd had a bit of a bug or something earlier in the weekend. So given that was the case, yeah, Sargeant definitely did the right thing, knowing his limits and getting out of there. The other drivers were either on or very much over their limit during the Grand Prix, and thankfully nothing severe happened. Now, there's no walls right next to the track, thankfully, but even though that's the case, if you lose consciousness at 160 miles an hour going around a corner, you're off, and there's a potentially serious accident waiting to happen there. I mean, it happened to Felipe Massa when the spring hit him in the helmet. He lost consciousness. Massive accident, even with a big runoff area. And, he's very lucky to still be alive, really, as a result of that. As Stroll says, it's ridiculous. I was passing out in the high-speed corners. Pretty much all the drivers said the same thing, mainly due to the intense dehydration. They probably lost 3 to 4 kilos easily of body weight here just in water and hydration during the course of the Grand Prix. And even the water they have in the car, which isn't that much anyway, is boiling hot, really, because of those conditions, and the car's hot as well. I mean, those cockpits are easily 50 plus degrees. Then you've got the race suit on top, which is not exactly cool. I mean, man, yeah, they would be sweating buckets. And Albon suffered from acute heat exposure. Thankfully, the drivers all seem to be okay. They've been assessed, they've been cleared, and even Ocon said lap 15, he threw up in his helmet. I'm sure a lot of you guys heard about this yesterday. Apparently, he threw up during lap 15 and lap 16. Was so physically taxing, of course. He stuck it out, and he had a really good race, Ocon, to be fair. But, pretty much everyone was suffering with this. Even Verstappen, who won the race comfortably enough. It wasn't easy, but it was comfortable enough. He was, in the interviews, kind of struggling to stand up and hold his balance together. I think Norris seemed the least affected by it of pretty much all the drivers, apart from Hamilton and Sainz. They were probably the only drivers that got away lucky, really, because they weren't racing. Okay, Hamilton raced for about 10 seconds. So even Ocon, as he said, throwing up on lap 15, 16. Stroll says he was passing out in the car. Also, making the track narrower means that you don't have the same feeling. You can't really see the track limits. You can't really see where you're going because you're passing out. I was fully fading out with 20 laps to go, which is a third of the Grand Prix. My conditions started to worsen. And you can see as well why there might have been quite a lot of track limits violations here, because if you do exploit the track limits, you can lessen the G-force. If you go around a corner and you send your car really wide, the G-force is a bit less, maybe cope with it a bit easier. Obviously, you can take less speed as well, but no racing driver wants to take less speed. So, really tough scenario. And Charles Leclerc explains just why it was so bad, because it's not like there aren't other races where it's exceedingly hot. And this is October in the Qatar desert. I mean, we know what happened with the World Cup. They had to do it in December. They had to take breaks for cooling, stuff like this. Massive logistical issue to make that happen. But there have been other hot races before. Why was this so bad? Why was Leclerc calling it the toughest race of his career? Why I think Bottas called it torture? Like, the drivers are still going to drive. They're drivers. And it's very difficult to force them or to even get to a point where a driver voluntarily calls it a day. Fair play to Sargent for doing so. This is Charles Leclerc's explanation. And I honestly think a large part of it was to do with the mandatory pit stops. Usually during a Grand Prix, the tyres, those hard tyres, might have lasted the hardest compounds ever, right, that they at least used this year. Not the hardest compound ever, but the hardest one they used this year, the C1 compound. There is also the C0, but for whatever reason, they don't really use that. The C1 was the hard tyre. That, with some management, could have probably lasted 40 laps. I don't know. Probably that's a reasonable assessment. The issue is, though, they could only do 18 because the side of the tyres were not based on the compound of the rubber, but actually the construction of the tyre design itself. They were failing due to the curbs. Therefore, the FIA said, all right, you've got to do 3 pit stops. You can only do 18 laps on these tyres. And the tyres can easily do 18 laps, which means they have to push flat out. And this is something that I miss about Formula 1, to be honest. Back in the day, the drivers would pretty much do quali lap after quali lap after quali lap in the race because that was the fastest way. They didn't have to do any tyre management. But that takes a physical toll. You're doing 18 quali laps in a row pretty much on that set of tyres, pushing it to the maximum. It's massively physically taxing, more so than it is going even a second and a half slower a lap to preserve a better tyre life, which would normally be the case. Not the case in this race. That was forced. But the issue is you think, oh, well, next year this won't matter, so it's fine. Well, you don't know, do you? Are they going to fix the curbs? Are the tyres going to behave the same here next year as they do this year? And let's not forget, the Qatar Grand Prix has a contract until, I think, 2032. It's a long-term addition to the calendar. It ain't going away. I think it's a really good track in theory, and, well, it's good for qualifying at least. For racing, it's still pretty good as well. I think we saw some decent moments this weekend. But the other part of the discussion is when the drivers are seriously at risk. The heat is bad, the high-speed corners as well, which is, all the high-speed corners, massive G-forces in play, definitely makes it more difficult. And then, as he thought was the main reason, was the quali lap after quali lap. And as he said, it's not that physically their muscles are knackered. It's just the dehydration, losing so much water. And in the final 20 laps, you're barely conscious. I think this is what probably happened to Russell as well, because Russell also said he thought he was going to faint. He had a really great race, really good pace. But at the end of the race, I think people expected him to chuck the softs on, get the fastest lap and call it a day. But he actually dropped off mega, and I think he realised that, well, I'm not getting a podium. P4's the best I can do. Let me just survive, I'm happy to go 2, 3, 4 seconds a lap slower than I could, at least earlier in the Grand Prix, as long as I ensure Leclerc stays behind and I actually make it through this race without binning it off of my own accord because I've passed out. So I think that's probably what happened to Russell at the end of the race as well, with why his pace was falling off. Leclerc also mentioned that this makes the driver's reflexes worse as well. So if there was to be some sort of incident or pile-up or something like that, it's actually really difficult to, it's slower to react. The drivers would be in those circumstances, which makes things even more dangerous than they already would be. So then the question is, well, what do we do about this? Pretty much every driver said it. At some point, every driver was saying that either it's ridiculous, what we raced in yesterday, I was going to faint. George Russell said that was borderline too much. Verstappen said it was just way too hot to drive realistically this weekend, given the circumstances. Piastri said the hardest race he's ever been in. Basically, every driver said this. And even Norris, who was probably the least affected, I would say, looking at the way things went, said some people, immediately after the race he said this, ended up in the medical centre or straight up passing out. He says that some drivers literally did lose consciousness after the Grand Prix. And thankfully, it didn't happen during the Grand Prix. So this is when the question then turns to, all right, what do we do about this? What is the reasonable conclusion? Because the drivers want to drive, and they will drive in conditions which aren't necessarily good for them if you let them. And sure, the drivers are well within their rights to come into the pits and retire if they wish to, as Sargent did, but they're not really going to voluntarily do that. I think Sargent was already somewhat unwell, and that's probably why he was forced into that decision. But the other drivers, they made it through, but if that race had been 5 laps longer, I think we're seeing cars go off into the gravel and possibly into the wall, because the drivers are going to lose consciousness. Could have been some serious issues, and yeah, the chance of a safety car at the end of that race was probably massively higher than it appeared to be, given the circumstances. Will the FIA do anything about this? They fined Hamilton like 50k or something because he walked across the track. So yeah, sure, they've got that sorted. And obviously track limits were another big talking point this weekend. I don't love track limits. The drivers will go over them anyway. And I do not like the situation where drivers go over track limits and it takes 5, 10, sometimes even way longer than that after the Grand Prix ends or even qualifying ends to figure out who's actually got where, who's qualified where. That's a problem, and I think that there should be a better solution. I don't mind the idea that the white line is the limit, but the FIA enforce that very hard at the moment. The drivers aren't happy about that, and they're never going to be happy about it. They want to be able to use the track as they see fit, but the FIA and even Formula One, like they're tweeting about, I think even the picture I showed you at the start here, Formula One tweeted this out saying, oh, it's not called, not called a cool down room for nothing. And it's like, yeah, okay, cool. But, this is showing the drivers in an absolute state of physical exhaustion here based on the Grand Prix that Formula One has put them through. Will the FIA do anything? People are going to say, well, it's Qatar, obviously they're on the can there for a long time. They've got the money coming in. They've got what is a pretty spectacular circuit, at least for MotoGP, and I think for Formula One qualifying, definitely. But what is the solution here right now? I believe next year's race is going to be pushed back somewhat. We're in early October. It's hotter there than it could be later on. It could still be, it's Qatar. It's going to be hot. That's how it is. But it's probably not going to be as hot when they run the race next year as it was this year. The track layout does prioritize these type of things to be causing an issue, right? All those high-speed corners, the G-forces, I don't really think they're going to be changing that. Some would say, oh, well, tweak the layout so there's less of that and it's better for racing. Maybe bring in a couple more overtaking opportunities. They might do that, but I don't think they're particularly willing to change the circuit layout as it stands, nor do I think they really should have to, because I quite like the circuit, to be honest. The problem is that the circumstances that it resides in at the moment. Even Alex Brundle talked about this. Son of Martin Brundle, and does a lot of commentary for Formula 2 and stuff, if you guys ever watched that series. As he says, my first year of World Endurance Championship, 10 drivers left the Circuit of the Americas in September in an ambulance. And, that's the thing. It's not just that Qatar is hot. Other tracks, and Austin, for example, Kota, are very hot as well. F1 is massively more physical and twice the G, but I can confirm other motorsport drivers, the chat that he's in, is ablaze with saying that thank God it's happened in F1, so people will finally start caring about this. So lots of drivers have experienced this and want changes to it as a result. Will the FIA or Formula One act on this, or will they just say, well, the drivers can get on with it, they're racing drivers? This is Will Buxton's perspective that I don't agree with, to be honest, because he says these are elite sports people and the choice to compete is theirs alone. So, they're pushing beyond their limits. It's a fine line. Sure, my perspective is more like, if you allowed the drivers, whether they wanted to race at Spa in treacherous conditions where it's raining, the majority of drivers would say, yeah, I want to race. I'm a racing driver. Let's do it. We can cope with the conditions, even if it's not necessarily in their best interest to do so. The drivers also would drive and put up with potentially life-changing damage to their spine driving a porpoising Mercedes or whatever last year, to such an extent that the drivers were literally having serious back problems start to emerge, but they would put themselves through that because they wanted more points on the board. I don't think it really should be on the drivers to decide what the better circumstances are here. I am tending to agree with Charles Leclerc that if this was a normal Grand Prix slightly later in the year and it was not mandated that it had to be a 3-stop and there was no 18-lap limit which forced the drivers to push flat out all of the time, I don't think this would have been as big of a deal. It's physical, as in the same, Singapore is typically considered to be the most physical circuit on the calendar, and the one, if you're prepared for Singapore, you'll be prepared for anything. Qatar this year was worse, no doubt about it, but I think that if they can fix the tyre compounds, if the tyres don't have the issues that they had this year, and Pirelli are confident they don't have to impose this 18-lap stint limit, I am confident that next year it should be okay. Not great, but the drivers will prepare for this track as they'd prepare for Singapore. It does concern me that drivers are talking about passing out, because Singapore is very physical, physically demanding, even, just in your hands and wrist and arms as well, because lots of 90-degree difficult corners. This circuit is way more kind of mentally demanding, in the sense you need to be always concentrating, and the potential of losing blood flow to your head in those high Gs is way more than it is at Singapore. Thankfully, the barriers are further away, so the likelihood of a massive incident is probably less severe, but it's definitely one thing that the teams will have to look at. And, well, the FIA should look at this. Formula One should look at this. I don't know whether they will. I think it might be on the Drivers' Association, headed by George Russell, to bring this to the table and say, look, us drivers are not happy with those circumstances we raced in. We need to think about what we're going to do instead, because Qatar is not going away. I think we can be pretty clear about that. So even Alonso said, could they take some sort of break? I mean, that wouldn't really work for a Grand Prix. Like in the World Cup, the drivers took a break after a while. The footballers took a break after a while. Water break, cooling down break, stuff like this. And that worked. You can't really do that in a Grand Prix. And this is why Alonso is like, well, I'm not really sure what the better solution to this is. But I'm very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. And also just to mention that McLaren's pit stop that we talked about yesterday was confirmed as a 1.80 second stop, which is the fastest pit stop ever in Formula One history. As I said yesterday, McLaren are a customer team of Mercedes, but they are showing up Mercedes right now in effectively every single category. Strategy, operationally, even just bringing home results when you've got cars in good positions, and the car is better. It's incredible they achieved this, because the record was Red Bull with a 1.82 in the when it was 13-inch wheels, which were easier to put on and off. And there was the electronic thing. Now it's done manually. As soon as it's ready, someone has to say go, then it goes. That adds a little bit of extra delay. And these new 18-inch wheels are bigger, heavier, difficult, more difficult to manage. It wasn't believed that we'd really ever get down into the 1.9s again. And the fact that I think that Perez maybe had a 1.9-ish second stop earlier this year, the fact that they did on Norris a 1.80 is absolutely insane, and deserving of all the plaudits. And their pit stops all weekend were mega. This is the thing that blows my mind, really, is that the drivers were struggling so much, and yet the pit crews, I guess it's nice and cold in the garages, probably with aircon and stuff, but it can't be that cold, let's be honest. They come out here and probably do of all every team this weekend had marvelous pit stops, despite the seemingly atrocious conditions for the drivers. It seemed to somehow energize the pit crews to doing just phenomenal work. So hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.